So welcome everybody to this event on what's needed to unlock clean energy generation in the UK. I'm really delighted to introduce our panel of speakers today. We've got a great panel. My name's Maya. I work at the IPPR. I'm a senior research fellow here. And then if we go down the panel, we have Andrew Cockcroft from EDF. Andrew is responsible for ensuring that Hinkley Point C continues to work collaboratively with external partners to minimise impact and maximise the social and economic opportunities of Britain's largest energy project. He's got an academic background in sustainability and energy policy and was part of the team that wrote the initial planning application to get Hinkley Point C off the ground. So really curious to hear your reflections on that and whether things have changed. Next down the panel, we have Sam Richards, who's the CEO of Britain Remade. Sam is a former special advisor at Number 10, where until recently he worked on energy and environment, and he's a passionate advocate for clean growth across the UK. Wait for the minister to arrive. We've got Emma Pinchbeck here, who is the CEO of Energy UK. She's an expert in energy decarbonisation and the energy transition. Prior to being at Energy UK, she worked at Renewable UK, and we're really delighted to have her on the panel. And then next to me is my colleague Josh Emden, who leads IPPR's work on energy decarb and sort of developing just transition policy across all sectors of the economy. He's our lead on heat decarbonisation, industrial decarbonisation, and green jobs and skills. I'm going to kick off by asking our panellists to do a little 5-minute reflection on the question, and then I will probably take chair's privilege and ask a couple of questions before I open it up to you all. So, Andrew, can we kick off with you, if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Maya, and thanks to the IPPR for allowing us to be here and talk about such an important topic. So my job description, Head of Stakeholder Relations, but also it's the end part of that description that's important here, it's social impact. Little bit more about that as we sort of get into discussion, but it's an incredibly important part of why low carbon energy infrastructure and nuclear can deliver much more than the low carbon benefits that it says sort of on the tin. Net zero has a lot of opportunity, also significant challenges to its delivery. But with anything in life, I find something with a good amount of challenge delivers a lot of reward at the end. And it's clear to us, I think it'd be clear to all of us in the room, that net zero can deliver a lot of benefit, whether that be reduced energy bills, more stable energy bills, lower emissions, energy security, but more and more we see that it can help in boosting growth. And that's in terms of wider productivity measures, but also making a difference to the lives and prospects for people across the UK. Nuclear is very much part of that picture. It's very clear to us, and it's very clear to the new government. Michael was sitting there, I'm sure he would agree. Net zero needs nuclear. That's absolutely vital. And at a personal level, I see the difference that nuclear is already making to the lives and prospects of people from across the southwest of the UK. And it's unique. Energy as a whole is a unique thing because it can really help those twin missions that the new government has, that mission for growth, and also that mission for clean energy. And we are very much part of that. But this session is also around a sort of a slightly more difficult conversation around the challenges and the barriers to unlocking all of that potential. For Hinkley Point C, for my project, we've gone first with new nuclear in the UK. It has been hard, it has been a challenge for us, but those challenges have given us the benefit of being able to pass our learnings on to future projects across nuclear, across renewables, and the wider infrastructure sector. And we'll get into more of these issues as we move through the discussion. But we know now that we cannot lose the momentum that we have started at Hinkley Point C as Emma knows, sort of with renewables across the country, we have started the ball rolling. We know that momentum is important. It keeps the supply chain going. It keeps the skills that we are creating moving from project to project. That's important for our trades union partners as we look to ensure maximum benefit for British-based skills and job opportunities. We also know that building and repeating is best. So we can do this. That's very, very clear. We have the opportunity to deliver net zero right here. But we need to take what we know we can do, repeat over and over again with real clarity on that overall purpose. We also have the start of a skills legacy here. We've done a lot of work at Hinkley Point C, locally based centres of excellence, kick-starting careers in engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical skills, and a whole host of construction specialities that we're ready to transfer to all energy projects and infrastructure. So this is just one part of that puzzle. But we do need to understand that that skills landscape is hard. We really, really need to work on that if we're going to deliver this vision to 2030 and also to 2050. And then finally, and I know something close to Sam's heart, is the planning system. Planning reform is absolutely essential. So we know that the UK is one of the hardest places to build. It's not the quickest here in the UK, and it's certainly one of the most expensive. That makes it hard for people to invest. And this is about unlocking that investment too. We need to work on that, and sort of some of the conversations around planning reform, we need to see as unlocking that growth puzzle. But overall, I'm very optimistic about the future. We can get through these challenges, and it's working together. We're going to do that with that being with GB Energy, with it be the mission boards, with it being sort of our partners sort of on this panel and you in the room. So very, very pleased to be here and to be getting into the depths of those issues I've just laid out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I really liked your good challenge delivers good rewards and the sort of point about the reflections, passing those on. And I'm going to hand over to Sam next, if that's okay, to give us your reflections on the sort of question posed.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Sam Richards. I'm the CEO of Britain Remade. Britain Remade is a campaign to make it easier to build stuff, new homes, so that young people can get on the housing ladder, new transport links to make it easier for people to see friends and family, and new sources of clean energy to cut our bills and cut emissions. Now, I can see there's lots of energy experts in the room. Does anyone know how long it takes to physically construct, not the entire timeline, not if we strip away the planning processes and the grid connections, to actually physically build an offshore wind farm? Anyone want to shout out? How long does it take? 15 years. We have over there any other suggestions? So to actually physically build one of these incredible offshore wind farms with turbines the size of the Shard, 2 years. Just 2 years to actually build the things out to sea. But how long does the entire process take at the moment with the environmental impact assessments, the planning constraints, and the grid connections? It takes up to 13 years. And I'll remind you that our clean energy deadline, 2030, is 6 years away. So that gap, that 11-year difference between the time that it takes to actually physically build the thing is all in the planning processes and the grid connections. So in there is obviously intense frustration, but also there should be a real sense of hope that we can do this. We have the technology. We just have to cut away at some of this red tape. So what then, if we get down into it, so what is in there? So we talked about environmental impact assessments, and the Boreas wind farm off the Norfolk coast had an environmental impact assessment that was longer than the combined works of Tolstoy and Proust. These documents are not protecting our environment. It's really important to remember this, that all of our key biodiversity indicators are in decline. They have been for decades: farmland birds, insect life. All our key natural indicators are in decline under the current framework of environmental protections. But we are also adding tens of thousands of pages of paperwork for developers that currently adds all that delay to building new sources of green power that we need to tackle climate change. Also, by the way, the greatest driver of biodiversity loss. So that is the current situation. And I want to talk actually specifically about nuclear power as well, given that we're here with EDF, because we know that we need to build out new renewables as fast as possible. We know that the costs have fallen. But this is a country that built the world's first commercial nuclear power plant. In the mid-1960s, we had more nuclear reactors in this country than the rest of the world put together. But we've stopped building them. I know that there is some incredible work going on in the southwest, but it has been 29 years since we've built a new nuclear power station. And why is this? It's because we have made it far too expensive for ourselves. Whereas the cost curve on renewable power has gone consistently in the right direction, with a small blip from the inflationary pressures from the war in Ukraine, the cost curve for nuclear in most of the world has gone in the opposite direction. But this is not inevitable. This is not a core part of the technology, because we see what they're doing in South Korea, where they, by building in fleet, have consistently driven down the costs of new nuclear energy. It's also the case that the environmental impact assessments for new nuclear and the excessive mitigation measures that we force nuclear builders to take are driving up costs. There are currently 22 salmon that Hinkley are having to spend millions of pounds in order to protect. Now, look, we all love salmon, but it seems to me that we are burdening our clean energy developers with absurd levels of mitigation measures, and in the process are driving up the costs of a zero carbon power that is going to be absolutely fundamental, not just to tackling climate change, but to underpinning our future growth. Britain's economic strength since the Industrial Revolution has been built on being an energy superpower. We became the richest country in the world by burning coal, huge amounts of it. And our future economic strength lies in, again, becoming an energy superpower, but this time, ideally, based on an energy source that is not burning the planet to a crisp. We have the technology. We just need to cut through the red tape that is currently making things far too long and far more expensive than we need to.
Thank you, Sam. Going to come straight over to you, Emma, to follow that.
Yeah, follow that. I spend my life nicking Sam's talking points, so conveniently, I'm going to do it again. I was thinking about a convenient way to sum up the challenges of the next 10 years, and I recalled that when it was COP26, the UK government had a kind of list of 5 things that were helpfully alliterative, and it was like coal, cash, cars, trees, carbon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're like, yeah, that's right. You were there. Maybe it's not a great analogy then. But it's similar in energy, and people have different versions of this. I think Michael Liebrecht calls it the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I do not use that language, but I do think we've got 4 considerable challenges ahead, and maybe a 5th one. The first is the grid, the physical grid, but also making the energy system work together. And others have talked to it, but it can take up to 15 years to get a grid connection in the UK, which is obviously far too long with the government's energy mission in mind. We are reforming how we do connections in this country. The new national system operator has already brought forward some changes, but we've got over 800 gigawatts of projects in the queue. That's enough to deliver net zero, like about 6 times over, I think. Obviously, not all of those projects will get built, so there's a need to really work out how to rationalise what is currently first come, first served connections. We also need to know where we're building stuff on the system, and that's important because there's lots of change happening on the demand side as well as on the supply side. And the UK is this, I'm biased, but it's a brilliant energy system because we've got a bit of everything. We've got very large-scale infrastructure like nuclear power stations. We've also got offshore wind, big transmission-connected kit, big kit. We've also got lots of onshore wind, community-level solar, household solar. We'll have electric vehicles. We should be doing heat electrification. We've got a very interesting, what I call 50-50 system. It's both very centralised and very distributed. I'm telling you that because that is a big coordination job. And the government have already commissioned a new spatial plan to map where we might build things to try and do it more conveniently. But I think there's more work to be done about maximising the flexibility of the system and matching supply and demand properly, particularly with heat as a massive challenge for the next 10 years in this government. My second, not horseman would be the planning system, and others have eloquently talked to it. There's some mad stories. We've all got our analogies. I think I'm going to nick an EDF talking point and say that the environmental consenting for Sizewell was 40 times longer than the complete works of Shakespeare. Every single one of our offshore wind farms ran into challenges. Many of them had to be called in by the Secretary of State. And we've seen moves from the new Labour government already, not least Ed calling in and agreeing to large-scale solar farms that have been held up in planning and using Secretary of State powers to do that. We've also seen the return of onshore wind into the normalised planning framework. That's brilliant news. But there's more to be done in the planning bill, and we're looking to see sort of Sam's vision of the world where we can build stuff in 2 years, not 15, maybe closer to being realised. The third thing I'd say is, and this is a sort of instinct about a difference in energy policy for the next 10 years versus the previous 10 we've just been through, which is there's a conversation happening that's broader than price. We've demonstrated we can get the price down of renewables. They're very cheap. We understand how to build a overall cheap system. We're mobilising other clean technologies and the costs are coming down, things like batteries and electric vehicles and so on, globally. But I think there's a conversation happening about wider industrial value, and particularly with the Labour government, which is going to focus on jobs and industrial benefits. And because of competition for these technologies after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Europe trying to reduce its gas demand by investing in renewables and investing in heat electrification and investing in non-gas technologies, we're seeing a lot of competition for skilled labour, for the supply chain, for things like factory slots. And so we need to find an answer to that in policy that gives us that bigger footprint. I also think, by the way, just in terms of what the industry delivers for this country, training up the next generation of workers, investing in communities is something we need to up our game on even further than companies like EDF are doing in Somerset. And actually I use EDF all the time because one of the things about nuclear in terms of wider value is you go down to Somerset and every single person from like the taxi driver to the sandwich shop owner to the workers on site will tell you what a great thing that power plant is for the local area. And I'd like that right across the energy system. And my last sort of thing that I worry about or think about is money. There is no shortage of investment opportunity in the energy transition. Globally now, the investment in clean energy technology is outpacing the investment in fossil fuel for the first time. We are seeing huge competition from other markets like the US and China, from Europe. But that competition is a thing that the UK should worry about. For the previous 10 years, we were absolute market leaders in things like offshore wind. We were out ahead on our climate policy. We were out ahead in our energy market design. And I think increasingly there are other places for investors to put their money. So we'll be looking to the Chancellor's speech today at Business Day, but also to the budget for those signals to inward investment. And then more broadly on money, I think it's time to have a conversation about how and where we're funding energy. And one of the things we've been asking for from the government is to look at, say, rebalancing some of the policy costs on electricity and gas bills to try and give more benefits to consumers of energy, of this energy transition. We know renewables are cheap upon the supply side, but passing through some of those system benefits as early as possible in this decade, I think is absolutely critical for the net zero transition. So we're doing lots of work on bills. And you cannot detach affordability and how people feel about energy from their enthusiasm for this transition. So I'd expect to see a lot more work on that. Lastly, it's not a horseman, but overriding all of that, we've got very new architecture with this government, with the energy mission coming in. And I think that's a good thing, but we've also got GB Energy, we've got the National Wealth Fund, we've got the department, we've got departments, plural actually, in our world. And just working out how that architecture works and who does what is also really critical. And this morning we had also a breakfast on the EU. And there's a lot about UK-EU relations, which we are now talking about in order to kind of make the transition as cheap as possible and to kind of speed up things like interconnectors and North Sea and offshore wind. So there's a big piece, I think, to get our hands around on governance over the next 5 years.
Thank you so much. And I think we might come back to some of the questions around your 50-50 description.
Yeah,
Kind
my
of interesting.
50-50
There's an interesting question around governance and the devolution agenda and the need for a national strategy. So maybe we can come back.
And
to
I didn't mention it, but like the local power plan and how that interacts with sort of building big kit at scale. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Josh, over to you to round us off.
Yes.
Still no sign of the minister.
There's a huge amount that's been spoken about already, so I won't sort of go back through everything, but I think that a lot of really great points have been covered already. And I think that what we can see is that there are these enabling conditions that need to come into place. You can have the most ambitious sort of CFD schemes in the world, and those are very welcome. You can have a kind of increase of the budget, a long-term sort of setting out of policy, but obviously you need to create those enabling conditions that we have been speaking about a lot here. I guess, obviously, planning, infrastructure, skills, supply chains, all those areas have been touched on. So I might just sort of fill in a sort of few, maybe not gaps, but just additional thoughts. On the planning system in particular, we've so far been speaking a lot about offshore wind and sort of the excessive sort of the paperwork that's needed for that. Same with nuclear as well. On onshore wind, it's quite an interesting picture. Again, sort of similar situation, but there are some interesting opportunities as well where you could potentially have a kind of mutual benefit arrangement. So an example might be with peatland, where a lot of it is quite degraded. The Welsh planning system, as an example, is very restrictive about not being able to build on it. But actually, if you're able to have developers building on that land, and as a condition of building on that, you start to restore some of that land, then there's sort of an opportunity to do both there. A similar situation as well with sort of farming land and sheep agriculture, for example. Sheep absolutely love solar panels as an example. It's always a really nice example to sort of see in the press. So there's an example where you can have some mutual benefit with some of these planning arrangements. But admittedly, this is a situation where we're talking about solar and onshore wind as opposed to offshore and nuclear, where there are definitely sort of quite onerous conditions. The other thing on planning, I would say, and this is more of a kind of general point as well, is we could completely reform all of the planning system. We could put all the infrastructure in place that we wanted, whether that's pylons, whether that's offshore wind farms, but we could also really rub people's backs up the wrong way by doing that. And we could put people's noses out of joint. We could create a lot of ill will by doing that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do any of these things. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't reform planning, because I think we should. But we also need to have citizens' engagement as a really core principle of that. And whether that's sort of a citizens' jury, whether that's sort of local engagement panels, something that goes a little bit beyond just sort of feeling like people are being consulted and told that things are happening to them. So that can look like explaining to people, why this energy infrastructure is needed, why it's going to power current and future generations, why it's contributing to a net zero future. But also we can start to look a little bit more at things like community benefits, which is something that the industry is already doing. There's a lot going on about kind of voluntary community benefits, where a developer might sort of offer a kind of stake in the project, or it might sort of introduce something about some sort of community benefit fund. So there is lots of activity going on already, but we can potentially go a little bit further on that and actually sort of bring people in a lot more into the process. So again, definitely should do it, but let's not forget sort of people in the process. And there's a phrase that Professor Rebecca Willis always uses, which I really, really like, and I'm just going to steal it, which is going with the grain of people's motivation, because there's so much support for this among the public. So there's a way in which we can do that properly. A lot's been said about infrastructure already, so I won't kind of go into that. I'm sure there'll be sort of opportunities to discuss that as well. But on the skills piece as well, I suppose one thing I would say, and if the minister was here, I'd sort of like turn to him at this point and say it's really welcome that we have a lot more focus on these things, but there's some work we can do more on skills. At the moment there are lots of FE colleges that are in crisis in terms of the training providers. They just don't have the available training providers in place. The Agile education budget still needs to recover, from its sort of original high point back sort of in quite a few decades ago now. So there's lots of work we need to do in the skills system writ large, and that's across all nations, across the UK government and devolved administrations as well. But there is also an opportunity there to identify transferable skills. We've done a lot of work on this. We've done a lot of work sort of identifying what skills people have already and what they could move into, and what sort of skills they have between high carbon jobs and green jobs. Not necessarily the case that every single person needs to go into a green job, by the way. If we want a proper just transition, it means helping people into new jobs, regardless of whether or not they're green. So it might be all right just to have someone moving into a job that is, still compatible with a net zero future, but isn't necessarily in a green industry. But there are really good examples where that is the case. So a lot of people will already know about this, but obviously the offshore oil and gas moving into offshore wind, for example. There's a really good sort of quick win that we could do there, which is have the offshore skills passport, which is recognizing accreditation of training that oil and gas workers have done in the offshore wind sector. That's something that's happening now with the Scottish government, but we could really accelerate it, and UK government could step in to make that happen. So that's almost like a quick thing that we could do straight away, but I'll stop talking now and look forward to further questions.
Thank you very much, Josh. I have been informed that I think the Minister is on his way. But maybe whilst we're waiting, I'll take sort of chair's privilege and ask the first question. There's loads in there. I sort of want to pull on loads of it, but I think I'm going to come back to the sort of the planning system and the need to bring people along with us and how we manage the sort of competing missions. So the government have said they want to improve nature. They've got a mission for that. They want to build homes. They want to green the grid. And I'm curious to have your thoughts on what role should the planning system play in meeting all of those? So the sort of, I think when people say, the red tape question, I think there are people who are very concerned about biodiversity who get a bit nervous. But then if you talk to housing builders, they'll come from a different perspective. And I wondered what you see the role of the planning system in sort of holding those tensions, and particularly to sort of Josh's point about needing to bring communities along with you. And is that the planning system? Should that be something else? How do we sort of hold those tensions? And I might just go down the panel if that's all right, unless someone has a burning instinct to come in immediately.
If I start, it's a fascinating question, many elements to it. For us and our experience at Hinkley Point C, it comes down really to, I think, sort of two things in the system. Firstly, clarity of purpose, and sort of we often talk about the national policy statements. They're vital. They're not just a piece of document that sort of hangs around. We cannot move through all of this debating the central core of what we need to do. So sort of when we move through applications, debating the merits of an offshore wind farm, a nuclear power station, that's not what the debate is about. And that brings me to the second point, sort of our experience. The planning system needs to deliver proportionality, I think, and and Sam referenced some of the challenges we currently have around proportionality and our current experience for those very, very small number of fish that we are protecting. We're having to impact people too. So the system has to be balanced, and it has to support people as well as the environment. So if we are developing new areas of compensatory habitat, how do people fall into that? We cannot be sort of railroading local communities in taking away their kind of valuable assets as well. So clarity, national policy statements, and secondly, that proportionality of what they deliver.
Thank you. Sam?
I think it's really worth remembering that the current framework of environmental protections are not protecting nature, that the current planning system is both stopping us, or at least severely delaying us, in building the clean energy that we need and the homes that we need, and is also failing to protect biodiversity. Partly this is because a lot of it is often process-focused rather than outcome-focused, and the shift from environmental impact assessments towards environmental outcome reports, I think, is really important. But one way I think of squaring this circle is actually taking a leaf out of what a lot of European countries are doing now. So in Spain, they have done some proper environmental mapping, some proper spatial planning, so you know where your areas of high natural capital are, and those bits you protect, and you go, okay, we are not going to cover this in this pristine peacock in wind turbines or whatever. You then have some areas where you think, okay, this is sort of an amber light. There is the potential for development here, but we are going to need some mitigation measures. And then you have areas that we recognise, look, this is former intensive agricultural land. This is of low biodiversity value. Developers can build in this space. And moving to that sort of system, I think would also give people the confidence that we are not just giving developers a blank check, and would help bring people on the journey.
Thanks. Emma?
I think the minister is going to
I was
sneak
going to say.
Well, not sneaking, I just announced it. So there are some things that we've asked for, but I'll try and kind of raise them up to a sort of more strategic conversation. The first is this: there are national imperatives. There's infrastructure that we have to build. We have to build it to keep the lights on because we, need a new nuclear power station, or we need offshore wind, or we need, flexible plant in this place on the system, and we need a substation to connect those things. So there's some critically important national infrastructure that we know that we need, and we will certainly need for the energy mission. And there should be a planning regime that enables that infrastructure to get built. At the moment, it's called the DCO regime. We'd like to see more stuff in it, but also often it requires the Secretary of State to use their powers to say this is critically important national infrastructure, so we're building it. And that is one of those rare instances where you're not overriding local concern, but you are prioritising national need. The second thing we talked about in this plan is just some of the bureaucratic nightmare fuel that is actually being in the system, the numbers of pages and forms you have to fill out, the cost of doing it. And you're sitting on often project development for years waiting for this process to speed up, which costs money. I mean, it costs you about 2 billion quid a year in development to have an offshore wind site just sat there waiting for you to develop it, going through environmental and planning consent. So it's costing money. So just simplifying the process now where we can would be good. The third thing I say is this balance between local and national communities. And I used to work for WWF, the environmental organisation, and it was almost 10 years ago now I was doing that job. And we knew then that there was this sort of trade-off, this conversation coming about what do you do about puffins locally or puffins nationally? Because, climate change and a lot of the threats to biodiversity are now systemic. But people think about conservation emotionally in a very sort of put your arms around a local area that you love or a species that you love and want to protect way. And it is hard to get people to have a conversation that's in order to protect that species, let's say puffins, who are very at risk from climate change, as it happens, we're going to need to build some stuff and potentially do some harm that will try to mitigate where possible for this particular area or this particular small group of puffins. I don't know why I've got aim for puffins today. And that's emotionally quite a difficult conversation to have. I think some of it is meeting people where they're at, understanding that it is an emotional, small c, conservative instinct, which is admirable and desirable and quite British in lots of ways, that we want to work with and to have a more sophisticated Professor Becky Willis style conversation with them. But it is also about a government being able to weigh that kind of local benefit and the national imperative. And lastly, I think we should be helping communities benefit more broadly from infrastructure, and there is a live conversation about that happening in the energy sector. We already do big community benefit pots. An average wind farm will spend about 11 million quid in a community on, everything from the local school to a sports hall. But there's conversations about, can you do bill reduction? Can you do specific habitat protection? Can you work with the local community about what they really want? And I think that will help us too. So it's a collection of things. Not all, to answer your question, not all of it is planning, obviously.
Thank you. Minister, we're just going through a quick run of questions. So I'm just going to let Josh come back and then I'll hand over the floor.
I can dry out.
Yeah, I would let you catch your breath because you've just run from another event. And Josh.
Yeah, so in terms of how to balance the planning system, so I pretty much agree with everything that's been said already. I guess I'm always I said this earlier about obviously working with people on this, but I think that I'll go a bit beyond that, beyond almost the the citizens' engagement piece, which is really important. I think it's also about demonstrating the benefits to people as well. So this is something that actually the nuclear industry does really well, exactly as the examples that have been given already about the local employment that happens there. So it's also, it's explaining to people why it's important, but it's also demonstrating the benefits, again, beyond even community benefit schemes or voluntary benefit schemes, but actually having the local supply chains, having local manufacturing, having port infrastructure. And there's a reason why I think that some of the resistance is because at the moment, what we're seeing is we are very, very good at building offshore wind and onshore wind, despite the delays, despite the planning restrictions. We are still a world lead within it, the second largest installer of offshore wind in the world. I think we were 8th in onshore wind, even despite the sort of restrictions in England. So we are a world leader in installing wind power, but we are not very good at having the domestic manufacturing in place. Now, you can tell we've done a report on this recently because I'm going to go into some detail on this. But we have looked at the different areas and the different components that we're good at building in the wind supply chain, and there are other areas where we can do more. We are competing globally, but not even China is able to manufacture every single wind turbine that we're going to need globally, and there is a real opportunity there to do so in the UK as well. And that's just an example for wind power, but it's true kind of across the system. So if you can have building of manufacturing, and if you can have local jobs as a result, and if you can have this sort of a story like nuclear, exactly as you asked for, Emma, kind of across the supply chain, when we have these kind of domestic, this local content, if you like, then that can also help to bring people along because they can see right in front of them what the benefits are.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, I don't know that you're going to need much introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Delighted to welcome Michael Shanks MP, Minister for Energy, to the panel. He was appointed Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Secretary of State at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero on 9th of July this year, and was elected as an MP in October. I'm going to hand over to you for about 5 minutes to talk about what's needed to unlock clean energy in the UK.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning. Sorry I was late. I did that classic Labour Party thing of trying to do 4 fringe events in the same half hour, and then realised it was half an hour down the road, so apologies for that. I think you've already touched on all the really critical parts. I mean, I think what we've set ourselves with our clean power mission by 2030 is an incredibly ambitious but achievable goal. And look, I've been reflecting a bit on the 2 and a bit months I've been a minister, about some of the challenges that we face as a country, and particularly if we're going to achieve this mission, the real challenges that we face to get it over the line. But we've sort of had a bit of a feeling since we came into government that actually this is more achievable than we thought it was when we were in opposition. And partly that's because of the conversations I've been having with industry, with trade unions, with stakeholders all across the energy sector, that actually this sense of mission that we've created within government also feels like a sense of national mission outside of government. And the only way we're going to achieve what we want to achieve in this space, but with any of our missions, is by joining together all of the country to actually achieve them. So if I take the part within government first of all, to me, it shouldn't be a bold new idea to say that if you have a part to play in your department in delivering an outcome that we want as a government, you should be round the same table working out how you do it. It turns out that it actually is quite novel in government, and people love to go back to their little silos and remain defensive about what they can contribute or not. And what's changed in the last 2 months since the new government was elected is that it's the Prime Minister driving forward these missions. And you've nowhere to hide when you're sitting opposite him on the cabinet table and he says, this is a national mission, we've decided as a government, what are you doing about this bit, what are you doing about that bit, what are you doing about that bit? That's incredibly important because it means for the first time we've got the whole of government working towards the same aim. And this kind of false dichotomy that we had with the previous government of green on one side and growth on the other is also gone, because we know that the economic growth mission that we've got as a country is also our Clean Power by 2030 mission. They're 2 sides of the same coin. And that's incredibly important as well, because it means there is no battle to be won with the Treasury about this. It is an important outcome for the whole of government. Now, that's not to say that it's easy, but I sort of think in 14 years of opposition, we've worked incredibly hard to get into government. What's the point of getting into government if you're not going to tackle the tough stuff? And this is as tough as it gets, really, because what we're going to have to do to achieve this mission is, yes, build a huge amount more generation capacity, but we're also going to have to rewire the country in so many ways. We're going to have to massively upskill the next generation of apprentices and engineers and what we want to achieve next. We're going to have to really alter our approach to manufacturing and industry in this country, because not only, I think, have we got the opportunity to build things here, but we've got an imperative to build things in this country. We're perfectly capable of doing so. But for far too long, some of the offshore wind projects, which are great projects, but they were built in Spain and towed from the Netherlands, and only when they arrived in Scottish waters were they actually in this country. And I think we've got a huge amount more potential of building that infrastructure in this country. And this isn't a government that's agnostic on our industrial future. We want good, well-paid, trade unionised, skilled jobs in this country. And that's going to be a key element of what the National Wealth Fund and what GB Energy delivers. And if I just say a word about GB Energy, which I'm really privileged to be the Minister responsible for, and we hope will pass through all its parliamentary stages by the end of this year. The bill itself sets up the company, but what's really exciting is what's going on in the background now with the appointment of Jürgen Meyer as the interim chair, who comes with 30 years of experience in Siemens, has a real understanding of the industrial and manufacturing part of what we want to achieve with GB Energy, but also really seriously takes the community ownership part, which I think we touched on a bit earlier in terms of community consent. The reality is, if we're going to build everything that we need to build, the grid infrastructure in particular, we're going to have to build a lot of stuff, I think was your phrase, and I like that, stuff. But the Prime Minister and everyone has said, look, this is a challenge, but we're going to do it, because the days of burying our heads in the sand and saying, we'll worry about that in 5 years or 10 years are long gone. And we should have been doing some of this 10 or 15 years ago, but now we're picking up the pace and building it. And what we've done is try to sweep away some of the planning restrictions that hold back these projects, but still have at the heart the important role of communities in having consent, but also benefiting from these projects. And I want to see that broaden out more than just community benefit pots, which I think have their place, and some of them are actually really successful and ingrained in communities, but others actually don't really touch the bits of the communities that really need the benefit the most. And crucially, a lot of them don't give the public that much control over what that community benefit looks like. So we've gone right back to the drawing board, looking at whether that's money off bills, whether it's the community benefit fund as we have it at the moment, whether it's things like funding directly key pieces of infrastructure in a community so that there's a legacy from these projects. But in all of it, what we want is the public to be part of this mission with us. And I'll finish just with some polling that we saw recently, which I have to say took me a bit by surprise in just how much the public are supportive of this mission. GB Energy was by far the most popular policy of any party in the general election, by a considerable margin. And it was because what people saw in that was ambition from government, a stake for them in the energy future that we want to build together, and a new way of doing things, a way that shifts from what we've had in the past to something where actually we want to be developing our industrial future in this country. We want to be investing in clean power. We want what, frankly, a huge number of other countries around the world have benefited from for years, the public ownership in energy infrastructure. And the consent point in that polling was also interesting, because we asked questions around, would you be in favour of network infrastructure, e.g. pylons, being built near your community? Now, I would have expected that number to be quite low. It was in the high 70s. And even if you asked the question, okay, but what if it was right at the bottom of your garden? It dropped, of course it dropped, but it dropped to the high 60s. So there's still huge amount of public support when you make the case for this and you say, well, here's the benefit you're going to get from it, but yeah, we need to build this infrastructure. And my last reflection comes from some of the work we did during COVID. And the COVID inquiry has found a lot of things that government need to learn from, but one of them is, if you take the public with you, if you treat them like partners and grown-ups and serious people who understand the challenges and understand the opportunities, they will come with you on these ideas of national mission. And when we've been in times of struggle, like the COVID vaccine rollout, government got together and delivered in record speed the outcome that we needed. That is possible in a whole range of other bits of our public policy. We need to think about these problems differently, engage everybody, academics, industry, the public, anyone with ideas, anyone with challenge for us on how we can go faster and better, and be part of this national mission together. And I genuinely believe this is the most exciting time to be having this conversation.
Thank you very much.
A heartening note to end on.
I'm going to open up the floor now to questions, and I think, given time, I'm going to take them in groups of 3, and my colleague Keir is running around. So you had your hand up very soon, and then perhaps the person here in the dress, and then perhaps at the back there.
Good to go. So Andy Burwell from Worley. Worley are the biggest engineering company in the world in energy, chemicals and resources, so effectively the entire energy transition. I'm really enjoying the conversation about communities. I think we're broadening it in our thinking across all stakeholders and thinking about how trust kind of transcends those stakeholders, and right through government, but also finance, insurance, right down through communities. My question's a bit about governance, and we kind of touched upon this before you were here, Minister, and thinking about obviously GBE, but also the National Wealth Fund and other kind of important parts in the machinery. We know as industry that financial scale, efficiency, really, really important to provide confidence for investors. So how do you ensure that with all this kind of new governance, that you ensure that you build in efficiency within that system?
Thank you. Let's go then to you there, I think.
Thank you. Yes, Isabel Morris, Energy Policy Lead at the RSPB. I'm afraid my question is mostly for Sam. So everyone that I speak to in the industry says that the issue with the planning system is primarily grid and also resourcing of local authorities and statutory bodies. And we all know that ecosystem restoration is critical for climate action. And there are millions of nature charity members of MET as well. So, you know, the nature sector, by and large, does not support cutting environmental protections and does not support the move to EORs. So, you know, if you accept that biodiversity is critical to climate action, sort of how do you think that cutting environmental protections is going to be good for that and improve biodiversity indicators?
Thank you. And then we'll take one more at the back, and then I'll come to the panel to respond to those.
Thank you very much. My name is Chaitanya. I work as the head of environment at the New Economics Foundation. The question I have is on interest rates. We know high interest rates are really not good for building big kit. And the recent spike in interest rates obviously led to higher prices in the auction results as well. Is the government and the industry looking at alternative options, mechanisms to keep interest rates low? My understanding is roughly 30% of the costs perhaps, you know, rely on interest rates. So keeping them low seems very, very important. And it has to be, we would argue, one of the levers to get to net zero by 2030, amongst others. But I'm keen for the panel to reflect on that.
Thank you. Okay, so we had a question about the sort of trust and the sort of finance part and the sort of trust from investors. We had the sort of environmental question there and how do we protect nature, and then the question about interest rates. Minister, I might come to you first, and then I'll open it up to the other panellists, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, three really good questions. I'm going to try and tie them all together, but I'm not quite sure how yet, so I'll start speaking. I think the efficiency point is a really good one around the role of GB in the National Wealth Fund. I think, just to be really clear around GB Energy, and there'll be a lot more kind of detail on how it's going to work coming out soon, but the prospectus on GB Energy is worth reading, which goes into a bit more detail than the bill, which is just about setting up the company, really. And the important thing with it is, look, it's 8.3 billion over the course of a parliament. Now, I go into rooms sometimes where people sort of say, well, that's not very much money, which you know, I think is an extraordinary statement. It's a huge amount of money. But the key thing with it is, it's not the limit of the ambitions of GB Energy. So 8.3 billion is about crowding in 5-10 times that amount. And it's about GB Energy having a role in facilitating projects as much as it is around just the pure investment role. So I think there's a real, around efficiency point, one of the challenges we've got is we want as much generation capacity as possible by 2030. But the mechanisms we've got to get some of it over the line don't necessarily tally up with how much we actually want to get online. And some of it, particularly in some of the more nascent technologies, is about they just haven't got to the place where onshore wind is now, or offshore wind we hope is getting to. So GB Energy's got a role in kind of unlocking some of that potential, but also sort of creating the environment where we've essentially got kind of investable propositions that we think others can come in and do, so de-risking some of the project work. There was a point around kind of community ownership as well, which I think is the other bit I'm really excited about with GB Energy is we want community benefits, but we also want community ownership. And some of the community ownership projects also help with some of the grid issues, because we know, I was just talking to Matthew Hugh from EDF earlier on, they've got some projects where 1 or 2 of their turbines are community owned, but as part of a broader project. So there's real opportunities there for communities to have a stake in some of these bigger projects. But community ownership is key, and capacity building is the real issue there, because local authorities are on their knees. They're not going to have the capacity to pick up creating energy projects as a priority when they're trying to run housing and social care and everything else. So GB Energy's got a role there in supporting that capacity building for community groups. And on the point of the more kind of long-term economic situation, I think the really important point around what we're saying as a government, and you'll hear more from Rachel about this today, is we want to create the conditions where the UK becomes the default investable country for a lot of these opportunities. So we have huge potential already in our natural resources, in our skills base, but the economic situation hasn't been stable for a lot of people to invest. So if you had the option of investing in one country or in the UK, a lot of people have quite candidly said to me that it was just too risky because they didn't know where they were going to be 5, 10 years from now. That has changed. And it's really important not to understate how important it is that you've got a government with a clear mandate in this area in particular, but a clear mandate generally, with a chancellor and with a prime minister working together on a long-term economic strategy that we're not going to deviate from. And that next week there's not going to be a different chancellor in number 11, and the week after that another one. That's important. Now, interest rates are part of that mix, but the interest rate problem on the points that you make around borrowing for these projects follows the fact that there's a long-term economic strategy. And the second thing I'd say just on that is part of what we did as quickly as we could with Contract for Difference was to increase the size of the pot significantly, 50% more. We got 131 projects from it, including the world's biggest floating offshore wind farm. Really exciting. But partly that was, as well as getting capacity, it was about saying to industry, we're committed to this. So build your factories in the UK because this isn't going to shift next year or the year after. This is a 10, 15, 20-year project. So come to the UK and build the cable manufacturers and build the blade factories. Really, really important that the whole system is joined up, and that's what we're trying to deliver through our economic strategy and our energy strategy.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to, should we just go down and sort of respond to some of those?
Yeah. I've got a point on the trust, actually, and I think it's the first kind of element you mentioned rather than the second part of your question. You build trust through proof, and sort of we've spoken a lot about benefits, and we need to sort of provide evidence, I think, for local communities that this stuff works. And there's a lot of benefits that we've had from Hinkley Point C coming through from learning. One of those is that we are absolutely certain now the benefits that you can get from low carbon infrastructure. So we've spoken about that a bit in a hypothetical, but at Hinkley, we are just on the cusp of hitting 25,000 jobs created on that site over the past few years. Around about 40% of those jobs are going to local people. But more importantly, our training pipelines, the education pipelines are creating that longer term legacy, and sort of that's becoming ingrained in this community that we see. So those people at Hinkley, and around about 8,000 people have now been trained in locally based centres of excellence that we have. 8,000 of those people, the vast majority are from the local area. About a third of those people are from areas of multiple deprivation as well. And this is really those benefits, because those people are now able to take that community itself is able to go and export itself across the country. And that's the legacy. And I think, Minister, you mentioned legacy. Legacy is absolutely vital, because those benefits are not isolated just to that community. That legacy can be transferred across the entire area. And just to finish on, it's another big number. Supply chains, local businesses. We have now invested over £5 billion into the Southwest region, into local companies. These are the companies that will be able to take forward to build not just nuclear, renewables, other low carbon infrastructure that we need. And it's that transfer. It's tangible stuff.
Thank you, Andrew. Sam, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to respond to this point directly. So there's a few things here. Firstly, don't take it from me that environmental impact assessments as they currently operate are adding delay and cost to the process. EDF can talk to the delay that they've added to Hinkley. The environmental impact assessment for Sizewell is set to be even longer and is going to add even more cost to the process. So don't take it from me, take it from Emma and her members, who will also speak to the delay and costs that renewables developers are getting from the way that environmental impact assessments are currently delivered. So don't take it from me, but take it from all the people who are currently having to deal with the process and getting the infrastructure that we need built. But the second thing as well, I really want to return to this point. And it's so important to remember this, that not only are the planning processes, and particularly environmental impact assessments, gumming up the building of green power, but they are failing to protect nature. RSPB do fantastic work in demonstrating that all our key biodiversity indicators, from farmland birds, insect life, are in decline under the current framework of environmental regulations. So they are stopping us from building green power that will tackle climate change, one of the greatest drivers of biodiversity loss, and at the same time, they are failing to protect nature. And I think that there is a question here for the conservation groups that Emma sort of touched on and said in a more diplomatic way than I'm going to frame it now, which is, do you really care about climate change? Are we really in a climate crisis? Is this really a climate emergency? Because over the next 5 years, when ministers are going to be building a lot of stuff, and when there are going to be pylons going across Norfolk, and there are going to be new wind farms that are going to be slicing up kittiwakes, are we going to be seeing campaigns against these new sources of green energy and transmission lines from conservation groups who claim to care about the climate emergency, but consistently will campaign against new sources of clean power? Or can we see a way through whereby we develop a new framework of environmental regulations that both better protects nature, that diverts millions, billions of pounds of funding from new developers into habitat restoration, and at the same time builds the clean energy the country needs?
I want to just, I've got a reflection on your statement there, which is that I've also done quite a lot of talking to people, developers and environmental groups, and I think there is often a sense that each one only cares about their own issue. And actually, I think the point that you made at the end there, which is that we need a new regime, that means that there is, you're not saying we don't want any environmental protection, but the way that it's working is different. And I think that probably there's an argument to be made that both people who want the development and the sort of conservation groups need to be making both of those arguments, and perhaps actually there would be a real strong case to work together on this, because then you're sort of touching both issues, and that would probably also make your job easier, Minister, if you're trying to get government departments talking to each other. Who knows?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that, in that, as Sam said, I was slightly more diplomatic, but it's also because I come from that world, right? So, like, on a personal note, I came to work on energy mainly because of climate change, and I have worked inside an environmental NGO. There is a reason that WWF had an energy and infrastructure specialist team, and it was because we recognised that one of the biggest threats to precious habitats and biodiversity was climate change. It is a systemic issue caused by the burning of fossil fuels, and the only way you deal with that is to replace your energy infrastructure. I don't think I'm revealing any trade secrets to say the amount of tension between my team, the folks who liked building things, and the rest of the organisation was wild at times, because that is a tension that we should acknowledge, and it will be uncomfortable over the next decade, particularly the rate of stuff we're building. On the transmission side, I think we're building, oh no, Alex, I always get this stat wrong. Shout at me if I get it wrong. It's like 5 times the amount of infrastructure over the next 5 to 10 years that we've built over the previous 3 decades. And so there will be this acceleration in building stuff that people will notice. And I agree with Sam, we need a more sophisticated conversation about what conservation is. It's important to say we're not saying like build on everything. Like the vision of the industry that I represent is like we should do habitat restoration. We should be not building stuff on really valuable species or habitats. We should be doing restoration when we can. two tension points there. One, the cost of it. So this is a lively conversation I always end up having about stuff like undergrounding cables and the biodiversity impact of that and the cost of it and the aesthetic impact of it. We all pay for this infrastructure on our energy bills. So cost is a very real thing in these debates and where the cost sits and what it's for. And the second is this national-local trade-off. And I really don't think we've had a sophisticated enough conversation about that over the last 5 years, and we should. Kind of just on the cost question, it is a higher cost of capital decade than the one 10 years ago. You know, I might play my tiny violin for not building enough when the capital was cheap, and we had less competition, but we're here, we are where we are. I think that has some implications for policy which are quite interesting, again, at a even more interesting time for the system. One of those is that, like, the alchemy of large scale infrastructure investment never ceases to amuse and amaze me. Vibes is a thing for investors. You'll have had that on the radio this morning from the investment community saying, like, positivity helps. Like, all of the things you talked about, Minister, with, like, setting the UK up as a place to invest helps. These are 25-year investments often. So an investor will look at maybe their hurdle rates, the amount of return they need to clear an investment, and maybe take a bit less if they can see certainty and longevity and ease of, you know, the planning regime, a grid connection, being able to build the thing, over having a higher rate of return. There's a sort of a more sophisticated conversation going on in boardrooms than we sometimes represent. What it does mean in policy terms, I think, is deciding on what stuff like our price support regimes look like. So we've got the RAD model for nuclear, we've got the CFD, we've got cap and floor regimes, we've got all kinds of price support in the system, rightly to get large infrastructure builds. And there's a question about, are we at a point where the government is trying to get, like, large volumes built, and what does that mean for those mechanisms? And how do you square that off getting, you know, flexibility and more risk and more interesting business propositions going for things like heat electrification? Those of you who are sophisticated in the room will know that I'm basically talking about market reform, and I do not want to go near that in this conversation. But I think there is a genuine discussion to be had about, like, strategic investment and exciting, innovative demand-side innovation. And again, it's a not very sophisticated conversation at the moment. I think government really needs to tackle it pronto. And for what it's worth, I think they've only got 2 auctions, maybe even only 1, to get the amount of offshore wind built that we need to for the 2030 mission. So the CFD is critical. And I won't do Truss because I've talked enough. And also Alex has started to look frightened. So stop talking.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Public affairs teams in the audience, like, can you imagine what it's like working for me? All of them look harrowed when we're doing.
Josh?
Yeah, I do want to talk about market reform. No, not
No, please don't.
I will talk about it a little bit, though, I guess, just in the sense
It's like the rest of my conference will be that.
Yeah, I mean, so there is, I guess, there is a conversation that some people are having around, like, locational marginal pricing, right? The idea that, yeah, sorry, I said that word. I'm going to throw that little hand grenade in. So basically, I think I think this is an evolving conversation. There needs to be sensible conversations about it. I do think that there is a big risk that is a distraction, and that it increases the cost of capital. There are lots of studies that are being done. Ofgem did a study that looked at and said, well, if you introduce locational marginal pricing, that will only increase the cost of capital by about 0.5% at most. There are lots of studies that say actually it'll be about 2 to 3%, in which case all the benefits of doing that system and doing that scheme, which would take a long time, be quite disruptive, would all the benefits of doing that would be completely lost from that cost. So I think that on interest rates in particular and the cost of that capital impact, locational marginal pricing is something that we should consider, but probably should discard for the moment. Maybe it's something that we do once everything is built, then you can develop a more efficient system. Anyway, that's sort of like a sort of mini, like, sort of, I don't know, mini hand grenade or whatever to throw in there. But yeah, welcome any discussion maybe after the event on that one. On the planning stuff, I think I agree definitely for the kind of the plug for kind of constructive tension. I think that I've underlined this several times, though, your point about capacity as being an absolutely major
Yeah, no one's
issue.
mentioned it. Yeah, you're right.
So it's absolutely, I mean, again, you can tell we've got a report coming out on this because the number of times I mentioned Wales, but we've sort of heard from developers that, in natural resources Wales, there's literally one person, or has been, I don't know, presumably it's improved now, there's literally one person sort of approving all onshore wind projects. So obviously that needs to change. Obviously there needs to be a lot more capacity, both within the actual sort of governmental, statutory, nature and conservation bodies, and also local planning authorities as well. So capacity is a major, major issue. And that, I would love to see, I'm sure they do exist, I'd love to see a study that almost breaks down of the number of years of delay, how much of it is due to planning capacity. I'm sure there is a lot of that in there. Then finally, that point about sort of efficiency and organisation of these different sort of governmental bodies. I really welcome sort of the Minister's comments about what sort of GB Energy and National Wealth Fund is intended to do. Lots of thinking that I know is that's going into that. Lots of people that are doing studies on that. We've got a report that's coming out on that as well at some point as well. So lots of people kind of doing lots of thought on that, on how it should work. I guess the thing that I think is most welcome though is that when we're talking about sort of bringing in sort of private finance, bringing in private investment, this is not, and emphatically not, a kind of stereotypical sort of PFI type system. This is a sort of evolution of that. This is very much an emphasis on taking a stake in the investments. So if you want a sort of example of that, again, another sort of example from Wales, the sort of the Welsh Development Agency, which is starting to sort of come into force, if you like, or come into its own, where they'll be developing sort of the groundwork, if you like, the assessment for all the sort of onshore wind schemes, as an example, and then selling that on to developers. What that looks like, whether that's a sale or whether it's taking a minority stake, or perhaps still up for debate. But there are some really interesting examples on the ground, and I think that if GB Energy does anything like that, I think that'd be really welcome. So lots of thinking going into what it will look like, but there are sort of encouraging signs of what it already is.
Thank you, Josh. I think that people are going to want to get out to get to the Chancellor's speech. So I'm not going to take any more questions. I'm really sorry if people didn't get their questions answered, but I'm going to ask all of my panelists to do a 1 minute, and I do mean 1 minute, sort of summary of where we go from here. And I'm going to come down, starting with you, Andrew, if that's okay.
Thank you. 1 minute.
1 minute. I'm not going to get my time
I'll
out.
be less. Don't worry. I'm going to end on a really optimistic note. There's a sort of a creep into the negative and about the challenges. One thing I'm going to say is we know we can do this. At Hinkley, we are absolutely proof that low carbon infrastructure can deliver growth, it can deliver prosperity, and it can provide people with higher skilled, better paid jobs. And that legacy is going to go on to sort of alleviate some of those challenges that we see in the future.
Top points for speed. Sam.
I'm going to be even quicker. We have the technological solutions that we need to tackle the climate crisis. We just need to get building.
Well, that's a challenge, not to be even quicker than that.
Josh is going to have one word. Yeah.
Look, I think this is genuinely a hugely exciting moment for this, and we've got a government focused on it, we've got industry focused on it. The potential is huge for all our communities and for our energy future. What we are determined to do is move as fast as possible, and we are open to suggestions on that, I think is the really important thing to say. And some of this is about doing the big stuff, but Ed Miliband's charge when he became Secretary of State to the civil servants was also to look at all the incremental changes we can make along the way as well. And the 1% improvements on planning or on consenting or on infrastructure, whatever it might be, will all contribute to this as well. But the sense of national mission is important. Government is united on making sure we achieve this target. We need all of you in this room to give us the challenge and the ideas. We need everybody outside this room to do the same. And together, I think we can overcome any of the challenges that we've talked about today and the many, many others that we haven't had a chance to talk about.
Thank you.
The tech sector famously says you have to move fast and break things, and I always used to say in renewables and clean generation it was move fast and build things, and that is definitely the story for the next 10 years. And just to pick up on the good news from everyone else, we know that if we deliver on net zero, it's worth about £260 billion for the UK economy in 2050. And if that number is meaningless to you, you should know that's roughly the size of the entire UK manufacturing sector today. So I completely believe that you can tackle the environmental crisis, but also build a new economy at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, going last is great because you can think about what you're going to say, but it's bad because everyone else has already said it. So, I think that I'll kind of go back to the point I said at the beginning, which is that there is a lot of public support in this, so there's a really great opportunity to tap into the goodwill that people already have towards this and the public support that people have towards this. A lot of the sort of comments and what's been said is really encouraging, that I think we're all wanting to do that. So in all the different aspects, whether that's planning infrastructure, the sort of construction process, whether that's manufacturing, supply chains, there's a real opportunity to do that, and we look forward to what we have in store.
I completely underestimated you all. You were all much faster than I was. But let's bring it to a close there. If you could all join me in thanking our speakers.